Thank you so much, everyone. I am going to start off this evening talking a little bit about behaviour problems in dogs. I'm just going to give a very broad overview because obviously it's a big topic, it takes quite a long time to talk about. But then I'm going to focus in on behavioural expertise in shelters and just expand on some of the things that Brett was talking about earlier in terms of the programs we do to try and prevent problems developing, and also the focus we have on rehabilitation within the shelter environment. And then talk a little bit about USA programs. It's meant to be a discussion. I've put questions and discussion at the end, but please do feel free if you want to ask a question as I'm speaking, shout out or put your hand up. It'd be nice if it's a kind of discussion rather than me talking all the time, because I'm sure there are people in the room who've also got masses of expertise in this area. So I'm going to start talking about behaviour problems in dogs. And I think, you guys touched on this when you were introducing yourselves, but the thing that has always struck me about behaviour problems in dogs, and I do that because it's a weird categorisation, if you like, because a behaviour problem for a dog is something that the owner finds a problem. So there are a lot of behaviours that dogs show that create a welfare issue for them, but actually the owner themselves don't find it a problem, so it's not a behaviour problem. And equally, we have other things where the dog is just doing normal dog stuff and having a good old doggy time, and the owners find it a problem, and that becomes a behaviour problem. So it's a really, particularly in the sense of the veterinary world, it's a really weird area of study, because we've not only got to understand how dogs behave and the kind of things that lead to the development of different behavioural characteristics within dogs, but we've also got to understand people. We've got to understand what they tolerate, what they know, and as Brett was saying earlier, we really need to focus in our education programs on getting people to better understand dogs, because that's the way that we can build up tolerance of running around having a good time, playing with cushions and bringing in mud and all of those things that sometimes people don't tolerate very well. So actually trying to understand behaviour problems in the biggest sense is partly understanding dogs, but it's also a lot understanding people. So there is a kind of impact on the owner. The behaviour of the dog, I would say, is only one category in this. There's the impact on the owner, the impact on other people. We see quite a lot of dogs that are relinquished or come in for behaviour service because the owners are embarrassed in some way because the dog is barking at other people or barking at other dogs or barking when it's left on their own and the neighbours are complaining. So the kind of that impact on other people is also something that leads to issues, and that's all balanced with a relationship with the owner. We did some research years ago to try and understand that kind of how relationship and bond influences things like relinquishment, and actually it is probably one of the most critical factors, because people who are really bonded to their dog will tolerate a massive amount. They'll put up with never leaving their dog on their own. They will have people coming in every day to make sure that their dog isn't stressed when it's got separation problems. And actually we saw that people might have dogs with 5 or 6 behaviour problems, but because they're massively bonded to that dog, they will alter their whole lifestyle in order to cope with that and live with their dog. And yet others who are less bonded will not tolerate, for example, the dog shedding hair, or some of the kind of crazy things that we see, the dogs coming into rescue, and you think, why is this happening? So I guess that's the kind of first thing for me about behaviour problems. It's partly understanding dogs, but it's also largely trying to understand people and educate people. So when we're thinking about, is it a problem? I get this comes from some research we've been doing in the past around separation-related behaviour. And there are kind of multiple different factors which lead to whether something becomes a separation-related behaviour for dogs. So there's partly the behaviour of the dog, whether they're making a noise, whether they're being destructive, whether they're toileting. But it's also partly the environment for the owner, whether they have close neighbours, they might be in a rental property or shared accommodation or in a small apartment, for example, and their circumstance. Have they got any social support? Can they pay for the cost of daycare? And also things to do with the owner themselves around resilience, their time, how patient they are and that kind of thing. And other responsibilities if they've got kids, how much time they can put into looking after their dog. So actually the kind of behaviour cases that we see coming in around separation-related behaviour are linked to, and the relinquishments we get around separation-related behaviour are linked to all four of those. But we look at the behaviour of the dog that when they're left on their own, we see a whole plethora of other behaviours that dogs show when they're left on their own, which indicate that they have poor welfare, but the owners don't see the problem because it doesn't impact on their life, if you like. So we might get dogs that are pacing or salivating or looking out for their owners all the time. They might have really high levels of stress. If we measured their stress hormones, that would be really high. But they don't perceive to be a problem for the owners because they're not impacting on their lifestyle. So I think one of the things that we think about in terms of, I guess, the welfare of dogs and trying to understand dogs is this kind of sort of two sides of an issue, if you like. There's this kind of people tolerance thing, and then there's the whole kind of dog welfare thing where actually dogs are really struggling in environments where owners themselves don't actually perceive there's a problem at all. So I guess that's the sort of background that many of you will know that we're working in. It's that really complicated interaction between a dog problem and a person problem. Okay, so what are the things that I'm going to focus in on the dog bit now, having kind of highlighted that this is just one part of the reason why dogs come into us. But I'm going to focus on dogs and dog behaviour and the things that influence the behaviour of dogs. Dogs have lived with people for a long time. They have come originally from the grey wolf, or the ancestor of the grey wolf, and that evolution has happened over tens of thousands of years. So in some ways, they retain some characteristics of their ancestral species, but in other ways they are really different. And when the research around dogs was first kind of picking up pace back in the 1950s, 1960s, there was a real focus on the dog came from the wolf. So people would look at the behaviour of wolves and make lots of conclusions about what the behaviour of the dog is, or the reasons why dogs behaved in different ways. And we know now that actually the dog is quite a different species from the wolf. But there are things that are quite similar. And one of the key things that they retain from their evolutionary history is being sociable. And if you're a social species, you're really good at reading other individuals. So like people, we're a social species. We have evolved for millions of years to work together in order to survive. Which means that as a species, we're really good at looking at someone else and trying to work out how they're likely to behave in different circumstances. You know, you can look at your friends and think, it's not a good day to ask to borrow $5. Or if you're a vet, I'm not going to ask to swap rotors with that person just at the moment, I might wait till later. Because you can look at their face and you can read what their emotional state is likely to be, and alter your behaviour accordingly. And that's a key characteristic of being a social species. And dogs are also masters at that. They've retained that from their wolf ancestry. And that's really what makes them such good pets, because they can look at us work out what we're thinking and alter their behaviour accordingly. And they can do it with each other as well. They're really good at looking at other dogs and adjusting their behaviour. And I'm sure your 5 dogs are doing this all the time. They're kind of looking at each other and trying to work out, this dog really likes food, this dog really likes play. I know I'm not going to approach this dog when they're doing these things because that will happen, and adjusting their kind of social interaction. And all of you who have dogs will know that if you had a bad day and you're feeling tired and or you're annoyed about something, that your dog will adjust how they're behaving accordingly. So we've talked a little bit about a kind of ethology and social behaviour from origin of being from the evolutionary origin of being a wolf. But I said in some ways actually dogs are really different from wolves, and this is a really complicated diagram that I don't want to explain in any great detail, but really the idea of this diagram is based on some research we did looking at a natural group of dogs. And if you look at the research, early research on dogs, there was a lot of discussion around dogs having some kind of hierarchy or fixed hierarchy where there was, kind of boss dog at the top, and then some middle ranking dogs, and then some kind of poor guys at the bottom that everybody beat up on. But actually, from the research that we've done and others have done around the world, we know that kind of structure doesn't apply to dogs at all. They're much more loose, I suppose, based on individual interactions. So what this kind of weird graph thing here is the results of a study that we did where we looked at the interactions between lots of different dogs that had kind of free options to interact with each other. And basically, they have different types of interaction. They have preferred individuals that they talk to, play with, interact with, and that's really flexible and variable over time. And it's a little bit, I was kind of relating dog sociality to human sociality before, and it's very similar in the sense that your dog will go out to the park, see the dogs that he or she knows already, and have a good understanding of them. He will, I'm very distracted by Otis, so I'm going to use him as an example. So Otis might go out to the park and meet the dogs that he knows. I presume he's got doggy friends, has he? Yeah. So he'll go out and he'll meet his doggy friends, and he'll know when he sees those doggy friends how they're likely to behave towards him in different circumstances. So he might know, if I do a play bow, I know that they're going to react in a positive way and they're going to come and play with me. He might know some dogs that when they see him, they go a little bit tense and they're a little bit worried, and he's probably not going to play with them. He's going to wander off a little bit. So he'll have all of those different relationships and understandings of all the different dogs that he meets. And that's very similar to human society if you think about it. You've got people that you know, you kind of move in and out. I'm ignoring social media here now, by the way, thinking about real world. You've got people that you know, and you kind of move in and out of interactions. You kind of know how they're likely to respond in different circumstances, and you can pick up with friends that you haven't seen for a while because you've got that kind of cognitive memory of how they're likely to respond in different circumstances. Dogs are very, very similar in terms of their sociality. So we know they don't have this kind of very fixed hierarchical, I suppose, structure amongst themselves. And historically, the idea that they had this kind of very sort of fixed hierarchical structure was used to try and explain the way that they behaved. People talked about dogs trying to be dominant or trying to assert themselves or trying to be high-ranking. But because we know that they actually don't have that kind of structure, we now know that those explanations for their behaviour actually were based on nothing. And dogs don't behave as they do in order to try and achieve some kind of hierarchy or take a step up in the world. they're really behaving as they do because they've learned stuff about other individuals, whether they're other dogs or other people. And that learning is really, really complex in the same way that you do in your social world. You learn a whole range of really complex details about all the people you know and how they're likely to react in different circumstances. Dogs have very similar social cognition abilities. So, and that's largely why they're learning to behave as they do. So the factors in development of problem behaviours in dogs, there's multiple factors. I've talked a little bit about their kind of ethology. That's the kind of things that influence them as a dog. But if we think about dogs, in individual dogs, so if we think about Otis, for example, he will have his own personality that he's born with. He would have come from a litter of puppies, presumably. Did you have him as a puppy? Yeah, so, okay. So he would have maybe had brothers and sisters, and they might have had slightly different personalities. So if they, amongst a litter of puppies, we can actually see quite different outcomes, even within a litter that you might think are genetically quite similar. They can have different personality characteristics. And then on top of those personality characteristics, the early part of life for dogs is really important in terms of their learning. So they will learn, they have a period between about 4 and 12 weeks of age that we call the socialisation period. But during that period of time, they're basically learning about what is normal in life. And this is why we focus so much on puppy education and puppy classes and talk about puppies so much when we're talking about prevention. Because if we can influence a puppy during that early part of life, we can have a real influence on how that puppy is likely to behave right through life. So influencing that early development, and it's really it's as powerful as physical changes in the brain. The brain is still developing at that age. So there are new neurons developing in the brain, they're forming new connections. And actually, if you can influence the environment of a puppy at that time and influence the experiences it has, you're actually influencing how that brain physically develops over time. It's that powerful. So that early life experience, we talk about it a lot, but it is really fundamental in terms of setting how a puppy, the trajectory, if you like, of how a puppy is going to behave over time. But then over time, a dog's going to meet various different environmental challenges. Might be some kind of stressful things that happen, and how they respond to those stressful things will be partly dependent on their personality and partly dependent on whether they've met those things before and what their prior experience is. So I'm going to use going to the vet as an example, because I'm sure in the veterinary world you will know that dogs arrive in the veterinary clinic and they behave in very different ways. But if we have a dog that has a very, for example, calm personality, that is very well socialised, has come into the veterinary clinic multiple times and had a positive experience, and then has maybe had a road accident and comes in with and needs some kind of urgent care, that prior experience really kind of primes the dog ready to be able to cope with that much more challenging negative experience. Whereas if we have a dog that's never been into the veterinary practice before, or has only been in, had a big microchip put in and then squealed a lot and then got taken away again, next time that dog comes back in, it's going to be much more challenging and much more difficult. And if you need to do something, orthopedic surgery or whatever, or have the dog in the practice, or even trim their nails, yes, exactly, then it makes that much more complicated. So that kind of early life experience and all prior experiences will feed into the dog's understanding and knowledge of that particular context. And that's what we're always trying, when we're talking about prevention, we're always trying to get positive experiences in early, because if you can get a positive experience in early, you're proofing the dog against more negative. You're building resilience against more negative things happening in the future. And the vet clinic's always a really good example, because you know your regulars who come in that have had multiple positive experiences, you know they're going to always be really good clients because you put the work in and the owners have put the work in early on. Whereas if you have kind of new dogs or dogs that you know have always had problems having their nails cut in the past, they're always going to have that challenge. So early life experience is really, really critical. And then every time a dog does anything, it learns about it. So every time a dog is in the clinic having its nails clipped and it learns, for example, that it's going to hurt or it's going to be held down, and if it learns and if it wriggles, actually it manages to stop that nail clip happening, that behaviour becomes reinforced. It's going to use that behaviour again in the future. So every time we have a dog doing something, it's going to learn something about that in terms of the next time. So again, when we're talking about both rehabilitation and prevention work, we're really focusing on making sure we control the environment so that we can set up the dog to be learning the right thing, so they're not learning the wrong thing. We try and set up the situation so the dog is set up to succeed whenever we're doing any kind of training. And what we want over time is the dog to establish habitual patterns of behaviour that are positive, ones that we want rather than the ones that we don't want. Okay, I'm going to go through this very quickly just because it's kind of complicated, but what we have two sort of areas of types of behaviour that we see in all animals, which are really driven by underlying emotional states. And I'm just talking about this because emotional states are really fundamental in how dogs behave. They're fundamental in how we behave as well. And broadly, there are two types of emotional states. There are negative ones and there are positive ones. And they have an evolutionary advantage in the sense that if something happens that makes you feel bad, it drives the kinds of behaviours that you'd want to be able to get away from something. Okay? So if you feel bad, you want to be able to either run away, show appeasement behaviours so you kind of get out of a situation of conflict, or punch the other guy and make them run away. Because you want to get out of that kind of negative situation. If you feel good, you want to kind of move towards whatever it is, the context that you're in. You might want to go towards it, might want to get social contact, or you might want to look for food. So the kind of emotional state you're in is really important in terms of the kind of behaviour that you're likely to show. And that's a good evolutionary advantage to have that. I'm sure you can appreciate. But dogs are exactly the same. So the kind of behaviour they show is really driven by how they feel. So one of the key things that we're doing with behavioural rehabilitation and our prevention work is thinking about emotional states. We really want to get dogs into positive emotional states because they are related to the kind of positive behaviours that we see. So quite a lot of what we're doing in terms of our dog school or our rehabilitation work is trying to move dogs from negative states into positive states. And because when we think about avoidance behaviours, the kinds of problems that we see, and this is a little graphic, but I want you to imagine, for example, that there is a dog that is frightened of fireworks. Okay, let's call this dog. You have a dog that's frightened of fireworks. Okay. Fireworks. Yes. Okay. So we have a dog. We're going to call this dog Millie. Millie is frightened of fireworks because last year when there were fireworks going off, I was going to say fireworks night, but you guys didn't have Guy Fawkes or any of that, but we'll go for a generic firework night. So last year, when there were fireworks going off, Millie was put out into the garden and a firework went off in the yard next door. She was utterly terrified, but since then hasn't really come across fireworks and she's been fine. So the occasion that we're now thinking about, Millie it's late in the evening. Millie's owners put her out last thing at night because they want to put her out so she doesn't toilet inside. So they put her out into the yard, and she hears a noise in the distance that sounds a little bit like a firework. So she wants to come back in again. But the owners are they really want to get her outside because they need her not to toilet inside overnight. So they're really kind of pushing her to go outside. So she starts to feel a little bit of anxiety. She starts to feel a negative emotional state because for her, being outside is this awful, scary thing, and her owners are trying to make her go outside. From their point of view, it's quite reasonable. They just wanted to get her to go outside. They don't understand what's going on in her head. Now, this is a negative emotional state, so it could drive multiple different behaviours. So she could start by showing appeasement behaviour. So this is an appeasement behaviour. It's not a growl because the muzzle is quite soft and she's just pulling her muzzle back. But what we mean by appeasement behaviour is a behaviour that the dog shows in social situations to try and say, I'm really worried by this, please don't carry on doing what you're doing, I'm really worried, please stop. So she'll start showing this behaviour. What do you think Millie's owners would do?
A lot of times people will say, the dog's not behaving. They're not doing what I want them to do. I told them to go outside and they're not going.
Yes.
I feel like people focus on that
Yeah.
as opposed to why are they not
Yes.
going outside.
Absolutely, you're right. So they're probably likely to ignore her appeasement behaviours. Yeah. And that's what quite often happens with this kind of scenario. The dog starts to show behaviours that indicate it's a little bit worried, but the owner's focus is completely different. The owner's focus is, I need to get my dog outside because I've got to get the kids to bed and all these other things happening. I need to get Millie outside. So what will she learn in this circumstance, do you think?
That appeasement behavior did not work.
Yeah, fantastic. So she's going to learn that when it's in the evening and my owners are trying to get me outside, and there's scary stuff happening outside, there's no point showing appeasement behaviour because that doesn't work. So she might try something different. She might try. I appreciate this is a different dog, by the way.
You get scared.
Yes. So she might try a different kind of avoidance. She might go upstairs and hide underneath a bed or a sofa because she really doesn't want to go outside. It's super scary, terrifying outside. Don't want to go outside. I'm going to go and hide. What would most owners do?
Drag the dog outside.
Yeah, exactly. They think, I've got to get Millie outside, I've got to get kids to bed, all of that. So they will probably go and find her, get her, put her outside into the garden. So what does poor Millie learn? Doesn't work. Yeah. Hiding doesn't work. Oh, PowerPoint failure. So the next time they go and to try and get her, her only other behavioural option associated with negative emotional states is to punch the other guy and make them move away. Yeah? So she might try this because it's terrifying going outside. She really doesn't want to go outside. And the owners are persisting in approaching her and trying to get her to move outside. What would most owners do if they have a dog who's never shown aggression before and she growls or snarls at them? They might reprimand. What might they do immediately? Yeah, they go, oh my God, she growled at me. So what would Millie learn from that? It works, absolutely. So that that behaviour gets reinforced. This is quite a simple example, but it gives you an idea. This is how most problem behaviours develop, because dogs are learning, in this situation, if this happens, my best option is to do this. And quite often it might be aggression, it might be running away, it might be showing a whole range of other behaviours, but the one that works from the dog's point of view to resolve the problem that it's in is the one that's going to get reinforced. Now, if this happened again the next night, she would probably learn, and she showed that same behaviour again, it gets a little bit more reinforced, and then every night, if it happened again and again and again, she might learn that actually aggression is the most effective thing to do. She'll gradually get more confident in showing that. So we might see a dog to start with that is a bit kind of, I'm not sure whether to show aggression or whether to hide or whether to show appeasement, and you get this kind of mixture of behaviours happening. Over time, she'll go much quicker and go into aggression straight away. I recognise this situation, the news programme's just finished, I recognise the signature tune, my owners are coming towards me, it's getting dark, they're coming towards me, the hand's going towards my collar, I'll go into aggression straight away. And then I might develop into showing aggression as soon as the signature finishes on the news, because she knows what's going to happen. Okay? So what we tend to do is end up with dogs that have learnt this and had reinforced this behaviour over time, purely because people haven't recognised early what the signs of the problem are and what the underlying emotion is. That makes sense. Okay, so a lot of the work we do in terms of education and our prevention programs is all about understanding body language. And it seems very simple, it seems very kind of basic thing to try and teach people, but this is the fundamental. If we can get people to understand and read their dogs better, if that owner could pick up when Millie was first showing appeasement behaviours and stop and think, I think you said they've got their own agenda, they're not stopping and thinking why. That's what we need people to do, is to recognise these kinds of signs of anxiety and think, oh, that's a sign of anxiety. Why is that happening? And then think through a better way of approaching the problem. That's fundamentally how we can prevent these kind of problem behaviours developing. Okay, so and then in terms of changing undesired behaviour, when that kind of behaviour is developed, and this is a very simplistic approach to it, what we need to do is to kind of, in the Millie example, we'd want to go back in history and try and identify what happened, how did this develop. So our diagnosis is all about trying to identify the emotional state and the context, the very specific context in which it occurred, or the multiple contexts in which it occurs. And then fundamentally, we want to change that emotional state from a negative emotional state to a positive one. And we do that by trying to change the environment and the consequence of that behaviour. And then we need to establish a new behaviour that's completely incompatible, that's related to a positive emotional state. So all of our rehabilitation work in shelters, as I said before, it's all about what's happening for this dog, what is it reacting to, what is its emotional state, what is the very specific context in which it occurs, and can we teach it something different about that context and get behaviours that are associated with a positive emotional state. I'm just going to kind of run through some of our programmes now. Just this some data from that Crystal gathered together. It's actually data from the Shelter Animals Count, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But I just wanted to kind of highlight the intake of dogs per state across the USA. The Shelter Animals Count is great actually because it tracks over time, which I'm sure you're aware. But really, really interesting data to look at how those change over time. But some of the other data that they collect is out of the dogs that are relinquished, the percentage that where the dogs are handed over. Sorry, it's about like 1 o'clock in the morning now for me. So I'm slowing down a little bit. The proportion of dogs that are presented to the shelters where the owners handed them over for euthanasia is actually pretty high. And I'm just presenting this because it kind of really highlights the importance of the prevention side of what we do, because a lot of these dogs are have been in the home for a long time. The problems, one of the problems of people tolerating issues for a long period of time is that quite often they will tolerate them and they're getting worse and worse and worse for the reasons we talked about before, that behaviours become reinforced until the point that the behaviour is so well established or moved to other contexts where actually they're very difficult dogs to actually look after in the home environment. A lot of people are handing over dogs with the idea that they are euthanized. And I think that really kind of highlights the issues that we are really focused on at Dogs Trust, in terms of, we looked about sort of 10 years ago at the increase in the number of dogs that were coming into us for behaviour reasons. And that was really the kind of driver for the kinds of programs that we've been developing at Dogs Trust, and the sort of increase in the number of behaviourists that we've been able to recruit and have in our centres and working with our dogs, is because we want to prevent those dogs being relinquished in the first place. We obviously want to help them when they're in the shelters in order to have that rehabilitation program, but the prevention is really one of the kind of key things that we are focused on. And many of you will be familiar with our dog school program. It's the kind of flagship part of our prevention strategy, if you like. And dog school really started, well, as I say, because we wanted to stop dogs being relinquished to us. But the program that we put together was really based on the kinds of problem behaviours that people seek help for. And we said, at the beginning of this evening, we looked at, there's the behaviour of the dog, and then there's also the tolerance, and there's also the kind of community factors as well. What we're trying to do in dog school is package all those factors together and try and educate people, to give them some basic training skills, but also to get them to understand things like body language, but also to give them some kind of thoughts and skills about dog ownership and how to get their dog to fit into their lifestyle. So dog school really started, is really, we call it a training class, but it's much more of a kind of education program. We're giving people some skills in order to get their dog to walk on a loose lead, to come back to them in the park and to sit in Starbucks, but also to understand when their dog is anxious, how to get their dog to be relaxed at the vet, how to teach their dog that it's okay to be left on its own when they go out or in the evening. So the dog school program was really set up to really focus in on those specific problems that commonly lead to the relinquishment or early euthanasia of dogs. So, and I was just talking about this earlier, but we did a little bit of research in New York to try and understand which kind of behaviours people found to be most of an issue. And I said to you, in the UK, kind of recall is really up there in terms of the numbers of problem behaviours. But in New York, it's much more around overexcitement, potentially reactivity to strangers, noise sensitivity, reactivity to other dogs. So some of the things are quite similar to the...
100%.
Yeah,
100%.
yeah. And what I thought was quite interesting, and this is quite similar actually to the UK, but 75% of people reported some kind of behaviour issue with their dog. Only 25% said there was no behaviour issues, which is fairly consistent. And data from other countries, Japan, Australia, whatever as well, they're actually quite similar. For things like separation-related behaviour, the prevalence that we see is actually the tip of the iceberg, because by its very nature it happens when people are not there. And unless they're doing something which disturbs the neighbours or they see when they come back. We did some research a few years back with a television company actually, but regardless of that, we filmed 40 dogs in their homes in a kind of area of Bristol, and also took cortisol, saliva samples, before and after leaving them. And there were sort of three groups. There were the classic, about 30%-ish of what might be called clinical cases of separation, where they were doing the kinds of things that people find intolerable, like shouting, destroying, toileting. But then there was about 15% that were relaxing, not doing anything. But the big chunk in the middle were dogs that were actually quite anxious. They were walking around, salivating, not relaxing, and they actually had the biggest increase in cortisol. So those are the dogs that were the most stressed, but they wouldn't actually come into something like this in terms of a categorization of separation-related behaviour. So you just got to take these kind of problem stats as we look at here in terms of these are the problems that people have, not necessarily the problems that dogs have. Okay, so we talked about early life of puppies. So our dog school program in the UK is really focused on puppies. We started out really focused on puppies because for me, if you can get puppy right, you can get dog right. You've got the best chance of preventing problems if you get that great experience in from the start. And you can set up the dog and the owner right from the start, establish the behaviours that you want, and make sure that when they come into new experiences that they're always really positive. But then we also started thinking about adolescent classes. So because quite often when people get a puppy, they do their kind of puppy training, they're going along quite happily, and then the dog hits adolescence and everything goes bonkers. By setting up the adolescent classes, we're kind of picking up those dogs that are, may have been all right but are developing new behaviours, but also it picks up those people who have never been to training. The puppies maybe had a few problems, but it's been tolerable. But once the kind of adolescent explosion happens, it's really, they can't live with it anymore, and they are seeking help. So our adolescent classes are really much more focused on frustration problems, overexcitement that is kind of a problem here. Those kinds of behaviours, teaching them, the owners at that point, to tolerate that change in behaviour and to help them, I guess, emotionally get through it. It's quite difficult if you've had a puppy and it's been well behaved and everything's fine, and then suddenly everything goes haywire. It's quite difficult for people to live with.
We see a lot of large breed dogs in the shelter, and I was wondering if a piece of it is also when they were a little puppy.
Yes.
It was okay, but then they grew big.
Yeah.
And that behavior when they were tiny felt like an okay behavior.
Absolutely.
And then all of a sudden it's not.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, a lot. I mean, if you look at, I think I was chatting to someone about pit bulls at the start. Yeah. Pit bulls and some of the larger breeds are banned in the UK. Because they're thought to be a risk for aggression, and we always campaign against that because there's absolutely no evidence that pit bulls or staffies or Rottweilers, whatever, are any more risk at showing aggression than any other breed. In fact, most of the research suggests that it's small dogs that are much more likely to be aggressive, and I think that's exactly as you're saying, that if people have a dog that's showing aggression, if it's a small dog that they can pick up, or it's tolerable, or it's not, if they bite it's not too bad, they will put up with that. Whereas if it's a large dog, they'll either put more effort in to prevent it in the first place, or the dog becomes relinquished because they can't cope with it. So absolutely, I think there's definitely a size factor in that. And then obviously our kind of adult classes, which are really focused on dogs coming out from rehoming centres and making sure they are set up with owner with their new dog, that they understand their dog, they understand how to pick up all those signs of body language, and they're really set up for success when they go off on with their new relationship. And then finally, in terms of rehabilitation in shelters, we're really dealing with those dogs with established problems. They've quite often got no prior history. We've got to work out what the kind of underlying emotional state is, what are the contexts in which these problem behaviours happen, and then put in place a rehab programme to change that behaviour, but then also maintain it over time and make sure it's the new owners, when the dogs are rehomed, are happy to carry on with that rehabilitation programme. So that our professional development programme that we're rolling out in both New York and LA is really focused on teaching staff within the shelter environment how to manage those dogs in that kind of rehabilitation space, if you like, trying to teach them the basic things around understanding why behaviour develops, body language, how dogs learn, so that they can start to do those programs of rehabilitation. And as Brett was talking about at the beginning, what we really want to do is pick up the dogs really early, make sure we get our rehabilitation program in, monitor the dogs carefully, make sure they're improving, help them move through into being able to be rehomed, and then provide post-adoption support once they're out into the homes.